Special meeting of the Galt City Council to order. Roll call, please.
Vice Mayor Payne. Here. Councilmember Hewer. Here. Councilmember Campion. Here. Councilmember Powers. Here. Mayor Cruz.
Here. Can you read the public comment section, please?
Under Government Code Section 54954.3, members of the public may address the council on any agenda item before or during consideration of the item. Speakers should restrict their comments to a maximum of 5 minutes. Please fill out a speaker sheet located on the table inside the entrances to the council chambers and forward the completed speaker sheet to the city clerk.
Thank you. We'll go straight into departmental workshop on the Eastview Liberty Ranch specific plan. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. Good afternoon. Pretty much picking up where we left off at our last workshop. However, I did want to just bring to your attention that based on discussions with the applicant, and also based on discussions from Planning Commission, City Council, and whatnot, we did finally convince the applicant's team to call out the medium density units as R2. So this map, which will come before you with the appropriate ordinance, reflects that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Mr. Rudolph, who will go ahead and take over from where we left off with regard to the CFD discussion and then the development agreement discussion.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to come down to the podium so I can see everybody and get direct eye contact. Couple of topics that I'm going to cover this afternoon. First, I want to talk a little bit about the CFD 2005. We had a little bit of discussion about that last time, and I want to go back and fill in a few of the pieces. And then we'll get into the development agreement. And then after we're done with the development agreement, we'll have an opportunity to address any questions that the council has on the totality of the project. So first, as it relates to CFD number 2005, this district formed in March of 2005. It was formed for a public safety purpose, and the way the proceeds, the revenue from this district are split 75% going towards police services and 25% towards fire services. The estimated revenue for this district this year is going to be about $228,000. I put on at each of your places this evening a copy of a map of the current district. So when the district was formed, it covered the totality of the existing city limits, and what this map shows is the subdivisions that have actually annexed to this particular district. And so you can see it's pretty sporadic. It's really just a few communities within the city that are now part of this particular district, which is why the revenues after over a decade are still at $228,000 annually. Where the revenue comes from is from 237 single-family homes, which pay $535 per unit, 170 approved lots, and then some undeveloped property. The reason I'm discussing this this afternoon is because the Eastview Liberty Ranch project will be required to annex to the district for an alternate district with no greater tax liability. The reason that this project is required to annex is for a couple of reasons. Even though it's outside of the boundaries of CFD 2005 as originally envisioned, I think the intent of the council was that all new development that developed within the city would have to annex to this particular district and share in this particular tax burden. And it seemed from staff perspective that if we didn't require this new development to annex, that we were creating an inequity within the community where development interior to the existing city limits would have to annex, but we have this large development that is currently on the outside of the city limits, soon to be annexed, would not share in that particular burden. When we started taking a look at CFD 2005, we thought that there might be several reasons why in the future the City Council might want to take another look at this particular district. First, the district's over 10 years old. The analytical data that was put together to form this district was done sometime in 2003, 2004. The rate of development has been less than 25% of what was anticipated when this district was formed. The Casunas CFD, which takes 25% of the proceeds from this district, has in fact formed a separate CFD in 2011, and that will replace 25% of the proceeds in the 2005 district. We've also had Measure R adopted by the voters, which provides an additional source of revenue to the police department, which was not envisioned back when the CFD was formed. And the last item is that if we came up with a new CFD, there'd be an opportunity for the City Council to make it a little bit broader purpose CFD. So it might pick up, in addition to public safety, it might pick up road maintenance and other service requirements within the community. So that's why when we crafted this condition and this term within the development agreement, we worded it that the project would annex to CFD 2005 or an alternate district if the City Council in future discussions decides to move forward with an alternate district. So just a little bit more on the map before I finish up on them. So as I indicated, the single-family residences within this district are currently paying $535 annually. If you take out the 25% that's going to the fire district, that's $401 annually. If you go into the fiscal impact analysis for this project, at the end of table 8.6, it indicates that the project annual maintenance cost would be, or is anticipated to be $173. So if you subtract that, that gives us a net available $228 that could be used for public safety, road maintenance, and any other authorized purposes under a CFD service district. So it's just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of the amount of funds that we would have the opportunity to spend on appropriate services. Any questions on the CFD?
Yeah, on the projected annual maintenance, is there a reason that we didn't actually look at what the city's costs are in the current city rather than relying on projected numbers? I mean, it just makes sense if you have a city and you know what your maintenance costs are that are loaded into this fee, that you can evaluate that on a case-by-case basis in the city.
I don't know, Chris, would you be able to help me as far as how that project annual maintenance cost was arrived at?
Well, I know how it was arrived at. I looked at the table, A6, but I'm wondering why didn't you just evaluate the city's budget to take a look at the actual costs? The projected annual may be significantly different than what the actual true cost is in the city of Galt.
What we anticipate the cost to be. We worked with the city and they peer reviewed those costs, and we took in their comment on what they thought the cost would be. So
I guess, so the question was never asked, why not just look at what our actual costs are? To me, that would make more sense. I mean, that doesn't seem like a real good explanation, but maybe Public Works, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you guys, we submitted the costs based on our estimates where they should be. Staff reviewed them, and we took on all those comments. Dave, I don't know if you want to provide any input on that as well.
Sorry I'm running late. Traffic down here was not fun. We did use the city's cost. We looked at the city's budget, and where the city's budget seemed insufficient, there was deferred maintenance, there were other issues that didn't reflect the level of service you wanted to provide. We increased those costs. Street maintenance is an example of that, and there were some building maintenance costs as well. So in the vast majority of cases, Chris used the city's current budget. There were a couple instances where we actually increased the city's budget to reflect service standards that we wanted to use. So it's either at or better than what you're experiencing right now.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that. It wasn't noted in the report. In the table itself, and it's kind of hard to tell, I see where it's broken down by areas. I'm having trouble finding it. We'll come back to it. I can't find the table right now. Go ahead.
Okay. Any other questions about the 2005 district? Okay, so we're going to move on to the development agreement. And, before we get into the actual terms of the agreement, I want to talk a little bit more in broader sense as to what a development agreement is and why are we considering a development agreement on this particular project. And the reason for having that discussion is to the best of my knowledge, I don't think the City of Galt has ever actually entered into a development agreement. I know in the time that I've been the city attorney, and since 2008, there has not been an opportunity to consider a development agreement. So I think it might be helpful to just talk about this vehicle in a little bit broader sense. And starting point for this discussion is this thing called the ABCO rule, and ABCO is the name of a court case. And if the City Council moves forward with this particular project and ultimately were to approve it without a development agreement, it puts the developer in a situation that if the city changes its land use regulations, this particular developer cannot claim the right to build out the project under the land use rules that exist today. The developer doesn't gain a right to move forward with the project pursuant to the existing rules until such time as the owner obtains a building permit, they perform substantial work in reliance upon that building permit, incur substantial liabilities in good faith reliance upon that document. So, to put it in a little bit more specific context, let's assume that within the next month the city approves for this project the annexation of 504 acres. You approve a general plan amendment, you approve the specific plan, zoning, you approve all three subdivision maps with the conditions that you're comfortable with, and then the developer starts to move forward with the development of this particular project. And I think under the documents, the phase one infrastructure cost, the backbone infrastructure, cost about $20 million. So the developer moves forward, puts in the $20 million in infrastructure in the land. And infrastructure costs are only a portion of the cost of actually developing this project, but a big number. And then the developer moves forward and records the final map, creates the lots, and starts to sell some of these villages to the merchant home builders. And then, let's say we're 3 years down the road, and the city decides to adopt regulations to require that prior to the issuance of the building permit, that purple pipe be installed in each and every subdivision and in the front yards of new lots. It's just an example of a new law that can come down the pike after the streets are already in, and because of the fact that the developer had not obtained a building permit, they would be subject to these new rules and regulations. So even in a situation where, let's say that you had a merchant builder, and the builder had pulled the building permit for 3 homes within a 50-lot subdivision. So the developer would have a right to proceed to build those 3 lots. But as it relates to the balance of even that subdivision, the remaining 50 lots would not be vested. The developer would have to, or the home builder would have to comply with this new rule as it relates to the remaining 47 homes. So it puts the developer as well as the builders in a situation where it's really hard to anticipate what is going to be the cost of the project, the requirements of the project. It really creates a high degree of uncertainty. And so what a developer looks for, especially a developer of a project of this magnitude, and when I talk about magnitude, it's first of all the dollar side of it, but also when you look at the timeline for the build out of this project, they're looking for a higher degree of certainty so that they can predict what the requirements are going to be, what the cost is going to be. And not all costs are going to be restricted, because in this particular development agreement, we're not locking in impact fees and processing fees. So there's going to be some element of uncertainty for the developer. But as it relates to the general plan, the specific plan, the zoning, the other land use rules, the developer is looking for a degree of certainty that if you're comfortable with this project, if this is the project the city council chooses to approve, consistent with those land use policies, that you're going to give the developer the ability to build the project out consistent with the rules that exist today. And this concept is called the concept of vested rights. So the developer gains a vested right to proceed with the project consistent with the rules that exist at the time of the project's approval or the execution of the development agreement.
But that shouldn't be confused with the zoning and development standards that the city has adopted as compared to this project, which are different. I think that should be made real clear that they are not the same rules and they are not the same procedures.
That's correct. You know, what's before you is a request to make certain changes.
Correct.
The general plan, changes to the zoning, to approve the maps, and it's going to be the council's discretion whether or not you approve the project in the totality of those entitlements. But if you decide to approve those projects, to entitle this project, what the development agreement in the broad sense gives the developer is it gives them the ability to build out the project consistent with those project approvals.
But see, let's say the state came down and said that we must do purple pipe. Okay, state passed a regulation that says all new homes built in your city, you're going to have, or built in California, you're going to have purple pipe. And we have a vested agreement with the developer. Then that development becomes exempt from meeting those regulations. If new regulations are imposed on us, then who has to bear the cost of those regulations if we have an agreement that says that it's not going to be this developed?
So there's actually a provision in the development agreement, and this is section 5.3, changes in state or federal law. It says this agreement shall not preclude the application to development of the property of changes in city laws which are specifically mandated or required by new state or federal laws or regulations. So we do have the ability to react to changes in federal or state law that are imposed upon the city. So we have carved that out. So the benefit to the developer I talked about, the degree of certainty from the city side, and this is a policy decision for the city council, but from staff perspective, why should we be at the table and consider entering into a development agreement, which is a voluntary document? We're not required to enter into this agreement. The benefit from the city perspective is, frankly, to induce the developer to make a long-term commitment to this community, a long-term investment in this particular project, to put in what will ultimately be $130 million in infrastructure costs and commit to building out a project over the 15-year timeframe. So, like I said, that's a policy decision for the City Council. But from staff perspective, that inducing that investment is a public benefit that I would draw to your attention. So one other point I want to talk about before I get into the development agreement is this concept of vesting tentative subdivision maps. Because you might say, hey, the developers applied for these vesting tentative subdivision maps. Why doesn't that solve the problem? Why do they need a development agreement in order to have the degree of certainty that you're talking about? And the reason for that is because the vesting tentative subdivision maps only really get the developer a very short way down the road. The vesting tentative subdivision map gives the developer the ability to build the project out consistent with the rules that are in place as of today, but that right only lives for 1 year after the final map is recorded, and the developer can come in and ask for an additional 1 year extension. So let's say that a developer, a home builder, records a final map for a 50-lot subdivision, and they get the 1 year extension, so they have a 2-year protection under the vested map. But they get 2 years down the road, and because of whatever the market conditions are, they've only built out 10 or 15 or 20 homes within their subdivision. Then the remaining 30 lots don't have any protection, and since you haven't pulled they haven't pulled a building permit, the city would have the ability to make changes to our land use rules, essentially mid-village development. And so a developer can minimize that risk to a certain degree by how they phase the project and how they record the final maps. But it's only a partial solution to the uncertainty that the development project would face. So under the development agreement, one of the terms in the DA, in the development agreement, would in fact extend the life of the maps so that the tentative maps live more than the normal 2 years. Then the developer would not have to rely upon the vesting tentative subdivision map protection. The real protection would be in the development agreement itself. Okay, so any questions before we get into the actual development agreement itself? Okay, so the development agreement is about an 18-page document. It has 28 different sections, and I've broken it out in the slide because sections 1 through 3, recitals, relationship between the developer and the city, effective date and term, we'll talk about in a moment, are pretty standard sections. And then when you get to the end of the document, which is sections 7 through 28, most of those terms are standardized. They don't change much between development agreements. And the real negotiations that occur on a project-by-project basis are really in sections 4, 5, and 6 of the document. And so that's really I'll certainly go through and prepare to go through any section you want to, but that's really the focus of my discussion this afternoon is going to be 4, 5, and 6. Okay, so talking a little bit about recitals, relationship, and terms. So one thing that's important at the front end of this document is the incorporation of the recitals, because one of the things that we have in the recitals is it lists the actual elements of the project that you are going to approve. The project approvals include the general plan amendment, the specific plan, the environmental document, the zoning, the tentative subdivision maps, the conditions on those maps, and the mitigation measures on the environmental document. And by incorporating those elements of the project, basically, all of those conditions become terms of the development agreement, and the developer has a contractual obligation to comply with the project approvals, the conditions of the project by that incorporation. And basically, if you end up approving the project, if the council is comfortable with the general plan amendment, if you are comfortable with the specific plan, with the maps, and you approve it, then what you're saying to the developer is, yes, we are giving you a right to proceed to build the project in the manner in which we, the city council, have approved it and authorized it. Relationship, I touched on this already, but it's a voluntary agreement. You don't have to approve a development agreement. You can act on other elements of the project and decide that you don't want to enter into a development agreement. It's a voluntary process. And if you do enter into the development agreement, it doesn't make us partners with the developers. They're not our agents. We still stand in the same position that we stand in today as a governmental agency and the developer. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the term of the agreement. So this development agreement relates to property that is not currently annexed to the city. And if we do enter into this agreement, it actually would not become operative until such time as the property is annexed to the city of Galt. And then after it's annexed, and there's a 5-year period of time for it to be annexed, if the annexation does not occur within 5 years, then the development agreement has no further force or effect. If the annexation occurs within 5 years, then from the point that the property is annexed, there would be 15 years for the project to build out. So the developer would have 15 years of protection to build out the project in accordance with the rules that are in place today.
Steve, does that agreement go with the developer, or does it, if he decided to sell it to somebody else, would the agreement still be in effect with whomever he sells it to?
It stays with the land, so it runs with the land. If the developer sells the project, the new owner would have the benefit as well as the obligations that are in the agreement.
With certain exceptions. Like you and I talked about earlier today with regard to fee credits and fee reimbursements.
Right.
Okay.
There's also an opportunity for the developer to get a 5-year extension of that initial 15-year term, and that 5-year extension would kick in after the developer has installed $20 million in public infrastructure. And so the reason for that division is that from staff perspective, we had some concerns about entitling a project, and then for whatever reason, the market changes, and there's really no development activity on the property. And so in that case, the development the development agreement would still be in place for 15 years, but the additional 5 years would kick in only if there's actual development on the property to the tune of $20 million in public infrastructure. Okay, so now moving on to Section 4 of the agreement, 4.1. And this is where we start really talking about the vested rights that I was mentioning earlier. So this section, 4.1, gives the developer vested rights to develop the property in accordance with the project approvals, which are all the elements of the project that are before you, or will be before you when we bring this forward on April 5th. And it gives the developer the ability to build out the project consistent with the permitted uses that exist today, the density that is approved with the project, consistent with the design elements that are embodied within the specific plan and the other entitlements, and the terms and conditions that are on the particular map. The project would not be subject to any future rules that would limit the rate or timing of development or change the permitted use. So this is the real guts of the benefit that the developer would get through the development agreement.
Steve, for just a second, I'd like to ask council, because we're going through, I think, some very detailed information, and at the last workshop, the city council didn't really have any discussion. We sat here and kind of took input from staff. I would like to have the opportunity to engage council on each one of these subjects, at least where I have questions, to ask council what your opinion is as we go through this, because I think it's important not only for you, but the public to understand what precisely is in here, and how does that truly benefit the city, or maybe not. So I think with that, I would like to, as we go through each section, have a policy discussion, whether we wish to change that particular policy as it relates to this development. So that's...
Certainly that the council has the option to do that. One point I would make is that, just like with any negotiation, I think you've got to look at the totality of the agreement, and that there were different concessions, trade-offs that both the developer made and the city made as we were going through the negotiation of this particular agreement. And you might find, for example, I'm not sure that this was an actual discussion we had, but just as an example, I indicated earlier that there was not a restriction on impact fees, that if the impact fees increase, the developer pays the going rate. When we first came to the developer, or to the table, the developer was asking for a term, I believe, in the neighborhood of 30 years. We negotiated this down to 15 years, and it might have been that the discussion was, fine, we're willing to reduce the term in trade-off for other concessions from the city side. And so as we go through and we talk about each of the individual terms, I just want the council to recognize that if we make significant changes to particular terms in the document, it may result in a situation where, frankly, we've got to go back to the table because from the developer side, it may no longer be a balanced agreement from their perspective.
Conversely, though, Steve, from at least from my point of view as a council member, this agreement and many of these documents were prepared without any consultation or advice or request for information with regard to change in policy. There are significant policy departures from what exists in the city today, so I think it's important that they be discussed. At the same time, I understand staff, you did your job as staff to negotiate. I think maybe it might have been different, but I think from that point of view, I think it needs to also be recognized that staff or the city council has had no input on this.
Okay, so before I move to the next section, is there a desire to have any, the council to have any discussion?
Well, I do have a question on the last sentence. It says the vested rights shall include modifications to the project approvals that do not materially change the scope, intent, objectives of the specific plan. Who makes that decision, and to what extent will that decision be made?
Well, that the implementation, the administration of this document would be handled at staff level. So as there was any changes to the project approvals.
What would be an example of this, so we can get an understanding of scope, intent, and objective?
So vested rights to develop.
It says modifications to project approvals. If the approvals are very clear and set forth as you stated in these documents, what can change?
So the developer, for example, could come in and ask for an amendment to a map, for example. And so if there was an actual, let's say a map came in that changed the actual lot count, that I think would be an example of a material change. If there was a change that, for example, was a lot line adjustment, which, modified, just one line between two particular lots, that would be an example of situation I think would not be, material. Well, do you have any?
I have a concern with that because there is a procedure for lot line adjustments. And if there are modifications to other subdivision maps in the city, it goes back through the process, at least to the Planning Commission, for review. So we have a process in place. I don't think that type of latitude should be granted to the extent that you can change subdivision maps, lot lines, lot numbers. I think that we have procedures in place that the Planning Commission should rightfully review. If it is changed, then it should be reviewed. To that extent, Council, I would prefer that we delete that last sentence.
What are you looking at? What section?
I'm looking at the development agreement. It's section 4.1.
So, the agreement is not changing the manner in which we deal with particular approvals. I mean, if a lot line adjustment, which I think actually is handled at staff level, if it was a planning commission action, this particular term of the development agreement would not change that from a planning commission action to a staff level.
Well, I'm just saying, I don't think that modifications, because it doesn't say insubstantial, it doesn't say substantial, it doesn't define the type of modification. It leaves open. Having been a practitioner of implementing these, I find this very problematic.
In what way, sir?
In that,
Give me an example.
in that you approve, the city approves a subdivision map, you look at it and you go out and you look at what's been built, it can be different than what was approved. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I think that there was a process by which that map was approved. And I think that that needs to, if there's going to be a change, it should go back through the process. That's all.
But is that something that staff would have been aware of, or is it just a violation?
They would be coming back to staff asking for a change at staff level.
Right.
That would otherwise be approved by the Planning Commission.
Okay.
So my understanding that when this says the vested right to develop shall include modifications, is this development agreement giving the developer the vested right to make modifications without going through any approval process? If they consider that it does not materially change the scope, intent, or objectives?
No, it's not. So basically, when you have a project of this nature, there are adjustments that are made through the life of the project as it moves towards build out. And it might be that when they actually get to the point of installing a particular street, that because of physical issues actually on the land, that they need to move a particular boundary line between two lots. And so the fact that there's been a modification between the size of lot 1 and lot 2 does not result in a situation where those modified lots are not entitled to vested protection. And so it builds into the document the ability to make those adjustments to the project as we move through implementation, and as long as they're not material changes, which I think is pretty much the same as substantial or insubstantial. I mean, that was just a word we used to try to differentiate between that situation, that those minor modifications would be entitled to the vested protection afforded by the agreement.
They would still have to go through the proper procedures.
Whatever procedure was.
Of the procedures that have to be approved at staff level, they would still have to take any of those kind of modifications to staff level. It just wouldn't change the vested right.
Depends on the type of modification. If it's a changing of the number of lots and staff's approving it, that is not consistent with our existing procedures. It would go to the Planning Commission.
So,
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and we're not changing that. And so if,
Well, we would be changing it, Steve. If it's done at staff level, staff does not approve or change, make modifications to tentative maps.
that's right, and this document is not altering that. If the developer came forward with a change in the number of lots, which is an amendment to the tentative map, that would go to the planning commission, and it,
Well, then,
have to look at it, but I think that would be an example of something which is not a minor modification.
Well, if you're saying a changing the number of lots is not a minor modification, so it wouldn't fall under this? I think what we need to do is then define what is and what is not a modification. If you're saying that it doesn't change, if they can't change a subdivision map, then we need to exclude or define what modifications are.
Well, I think it would be very difficult to write a provision which anticipated every type of change that could be made to a project over its build-out and differentiate between whether or not it was material or not material. And that, you know, staff is given the discretion to implement this agreement, and they're going to have to use their best judgment as the project builds out to draw a distinction between those changes that are material and those that are not.
Go ahead, sir.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, my name is Bill Abbott. I'm the land use counsel for the applicant. I want to underscore a point made by the city attorney, and that is this agreement, and in response to your point, this agreement does not modify your approval procedures. So if something happens in the future, the applicant has to follow the city's procedures. And if it's a staff approval, it remains a staff approval. If it's a planning commission approval, it remains a planning commission approval. If it's a city council required decision, that doesn't change. So this project in that regard would proceed in a similar manner to any other subdivision that's occurring in the city. What this sentence means is that if the city elects to grant the modification, then the modification is entitled to be a vested right under the development agreement. So that's what that section does. It doesn't change your approval process. It doesn't compel you to change the approvals. It just says if the city consents to that modification, then that modification is, that becomes a development right that is vested for purposes of the development agreement. So that's...
Then I think, Bill, then it would be easy enough to just add that language at the end of that to provide further clarification as to what it means. That you would follow you'd follow the city procedures for whatever the modification is. Established city procedures.
We would have no objection to that kind of amendment to the text.
Okay.
Good.
Okay. Any other questions or discussion the council would like to have before I move on to the next section? So the next section I wanted to talk about is additional landowner and city obligations. This is under 4.4 in the development agreement. And basically what this series of sections provide is that the developer will construct the improvements needed to serve the project. There will be, there's going to be different types of improvements that are going to be required to build out this project. And some of those improvements are not part of any city fee program, and those are the developer's responsibility. So an example would be interior streets within the subdivisions. So the developer picks up the full cost for building those particular streets. But there's some infrastructure that is in fact in our city's master plans, within our fee programs, and we collect fees from this developer as well as other developers for that infrastructure. And one of the provisions that is provided in this development agreement is that if the developer does in fact construct facilities that are part of a city fee program, city master plan, that the developer will be entitled to credit against the cost of those facilities for having built those facilities for the city. And so then when they come in to pull a building permit instead of paying the fee, they'll get a credit for, towards that particular fee program. Let's assume it's a, traffic facility. What the development agreement also provides is the actual amount and timing of the credit, or if the cost exceeds credit and the reimbursement, we will work that out through subsequent agreements. We don't know today what the actual, what those actual improvements are going to be, the cost of those, and so those agreements will be negotiated as the project starts moving into the implementation phase. There's also a section in the agreement, 4.4.3 on open space and trail credits. And the project includes certain open space and trail requirements that are in excess of what is required by the city. And so there is a provision built in here that in the event that the city were to adopt an impact fee in the future, and that's totally at the city's discretion whether or not we would create such a program. But if we did, the developer would be entitled to reimbursement for the cost of this excess open space and trails. Okay, moving on to, is there a comment that anybody wants to make before I move on to infrastructure?
Well, I was back on 4.41.
Okay.
And this is something you and I discussed earlier today. It says landowner shall construct the public improvements required for the project with the express requirements of the project approvals in the agreement. Certain improvements constructed by them will collect the fees, as you pointed out, and they'd be entitled to fee credits. Mm-hmm. Under normal circumstances, in the past, when and this is a big project, and I understand that. There may be fees that are due, or a fee credit, or a fee reimbursement. If I'm reading this correctly, it goes on to say, which credit shall be given upon completion of such fee credible improvements. So, is that to mean that once these improvements are completed, he submits an invoice and we pay him at that time, pay the developer at that time?
No, it doesn't mean that. What it means is that once the improvements are completed, then and accepted, then the developer would be entitled to the credit. But let's presume, for example, that the developer who owns the credit. The developer's paying the cost for the infrastructure, so the developer owns the credit. The developer has an option as the holder of those credits whether or not they are going to assign those credits to the particular merchant home builders. And if the developer does assign those credits and notifies the city, and there's a mechanism in this agreement for that, then when that merchant builder came in, we would provide that merchant builder with a credit. The other option is for the developer not to assign those credits. And let's say we get to the end of the project and it's been built out and the developer is still holding this right, then instead of a credit, it would become a reimbursement, a cash payment to the developer. And part of this subsequent agreement, this that I talked about, the credit and reimbursement agreement, would be to actually negotiate the timing for the reimbursement, if in fact we got to that scenario.
Well, we've never had a situation where the developer was actually in charge of the credits. I mean, this is the first time. I mean, they've either been entitled to a reimbursement, and there was a reimbursement agreement, and that was paid out over time, sometimes with diminished value, sometimes with not. However, I'm not sure that I fully understand how, because essentially the developer becomes the broker of whatever fee credit they own. And to that extent, I have some concern that if there was a shortage, say we have a problem with wastewater treatment plant, he has fee credits to the wastewater treatment plant, he paid $2,000 or $8,000, whatever they are. is there anything in here that says that they can't be increased in terms of their value, or I mean, I'm looking at extremes here, but it appears to be that we put, you know, public assets in the hands of a developer to dole out as they see fit.
So the credits would not change. At the time that the developer builds the infrastructure, they're going to have a certain cost for that infrastructure, and that's going to be a total dollar amount. And you know, if it's $100,000 and you know, the fees are $1,000 per home, then and the developer chose to assign that credit on a home by home basis, then that's the number of, you know, then there'd be a certain number of houses that would be able to be built until that credit was expired. But if the developer chooses not to assign those credits, but to just take a reimbursement, at the end of the day, the city's still going to pay the same $100,000. And so from our perspective, the economics are the same. The developer is going to build a project that costs, let's say, $100,000, and at the end of the day, we're going to reimburse the developer for that public infrastructure, either through reimbursement or credit, up to the true cost of that infrastructure.
The actual soft costs, and I had a question on this. I know that they've got everything in there that could possibly be included, but I don't know that our fee program includes any, other than hard costs. I don't know that we've ever looked at anything really other than that. So I'm wondering why we would include those. I understand that they're only entitled up to whatever we collect, but is there a reason for including all of those other costs?
Well, the reason for allowing credit for hard construction costs as well as soft costs is because those are realistic costs of actually building infrastructure. Soft costs include things such as construction management and design, and so
Sure.
Those are realistic costs of actually building the project. But as you indicated, I think we've protected ourselves by the fact that the maximum credit the landowner may receive for a facility shall be the amount allocated for that facility in the city's fee program. And so if we anticipated that a particular piece of infrastructure was going to cost $100,000 to build, including soft and hard costs, but the developer builds it and it costs $150,000, the reimbursement is going to be limited to $100,000 because that was what we contemplated in our fee program.
And then this is my last question in that section. It says that the landowner, this is in the last sentence, it says, if they're entitled to credits in excess of what they've reasonably used, the city shall reimburse the landowner as fees are received from development within the city. That is different from within the project area. So we would collect fees outside of this project area and remit those to the individual. That's number one. And number two, it doesn't say when. I mean, is this, what is the time period for reimbursement here?
So I think that's what we would need to work out in the subsequent credit and reimbursement agreement. And so I don't think, you know, all the details are not of that process are not in this particular document. But I think this is dealing with also a situation, it says, where the landowner has credit in excess of what may reasonably be used within the project. And so that's a situation where the cost of infrastructure was beyond what we would anticipate would be used up by the build out of the totality of the project. And so basically at the back end, if the infrastructure was built and the developer cannot recover the cost through the credit process, this provision provides the developer with some degree of surety that they're going to get reimbursed, because at the time you build out the project, if you restricted it to just the project, well, no more revenue is going to come in from the project because the developer already applied this expense in the project by virtue of the credit. If you limit it to the subdivision and it's all built out, there's no more money coming in from this particular project. And so for the developer to get any reimbursement, it would need to be related to fees that are received by the city from any development within the city.
But that would only apply in a case where there was surplus capacity. Because otherwise, it would be to serve this development and this development only. So you're talking a surplus capacity issue rather than normal construction. If you had to build a facility so big that he's not getting reimbursed for it, then it's going to serve other people, other development. So that is an excess capacity issue, not credits within the existing subdivision. So in my opinion, any reimbursement should come only from this project, not from other taxpayers in the city.
I don't know how that would work, because, I mean, if, you know, the developer's only gonna build surplus capacity because we require the developer to do so.
If it's called surplus capacity, this doesn't say surplus capacity, these are just credits. I think if we're going to do something like this, we need to carve something out that says surplus capacity or excess capacity and come up with a reimbursement program. But if it's for development, and that's all this agreement is contemplated, at least in my opinion, what is needed to serve this project. And if it's needed to serve this project, there should be no credits. Maybe to the developer for him to reallocate, but it should not go beyond the boundaries of this subdivision or this project. Explain to me how that would work otherwise.
So, let me just give it a shot, and then maybe Steve can help me out on this. But, you know, at the end of the day, we're gonna decide what the developer builds. I mean, they need to submit the improvement plans, and we decide what infrastructure, public infrastructure is built. And if the developer builds infrastructure and the cost of that infrastructure exceeds what the developer can recapture through credits within this project, then the only mechanism for the developer to get the balance that is owed is through a reimbursement, and by a reimbursement from fees paid by people outside of the project, because the people within the project are not going to pay fees. All those homes will have received a credit. And so the excess funds needed to make the developer whole need to come from outside the boundaries of the project.
Yeah, I guess, as we've been sitting here thinking about this, the only thing I can imagine is, or that I've thought of, is maybe some drainage improvements or something like that. Maybe you've oversized some pipes. But that's a marginal difference. And in fact, oftentimes I know Public Works has required some excess capacity, I don't call it excess capacity, but some buffer between what is absolute minimum and what is otherwise normally accepted. But I still see this as, if it's required to serve the subdivision, how is it then surplus capacity, with the exception of what I just described in terms of pipe size or something like that? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me.
So maybe I could help with a concrete example as a for instance. There was discussion in the last meeting about whether to have the developer build a well or pay fees for a well. In either case, pay connection fees that would then be used to build the well on at the city's lead. In either event, if we put in the well that we would envision, a deep well with some 1,500 to 2,000 gallon per minute capacity, that will be more than what is required to serve the 1,500 homes in the proposed, or 1,700, depending on what you're counting. And so the developer would only be required to pay their fair share of that if it's identified in our fee program, in this case our water fee, impact fee program, and whatever costs were identified in our fee program, he would be eligible for his fair share of those costs. But if he built the well, and there is excess capacity as an example, then he would be entitled to either give those credits to one of his master developers toward future homes, or to be repaid from other developers, new development, outside the project, only when those fees are paid.
And I don't disagree with that, but that's, again, a surplus capacity issue, number one. Number two, it's difficult, even if he were to be required to put in the well, I don't know that our fee is such that we even know what portion of the fee goes towards well development at this point. So I understand what you're saying, but I don't see how how we would possibly come to terms with that without actually going through the fee schedule and determining that. And that's getting a little off to the side. But my point is, if there is truly a surplus capacity issue, then we deal with it as surplus capacity. But everything else should be within the development solely.
Well, two comments, and Steve may want to elaborate, but one is, we're writing this development agreement to be broad and does not protect our impact fees, and we plan to initiate, prior to permits being pulled, new water fee study, impact fee study, new stormwater impact fee study, and new sewer impact fee studies. And they would be required to meet those. And whatever we decide or elect to include based on our master plans, and only to the extent that we include soft costs or not, that'd be the maximum they'd be eligible for, and only once they constructed it would they get the credit. So I think we're saying the same thing.
Well, as a matter of policy, and I would put it to council, I would say that this should be limited to the subdivision or the project area, which is the ranch, and that if it is determined at a subsequent time that there is applicability for reimbursement by the city, then I think that should be addressed as they develop whatever reimbursement agreements they're going to be developing. But I don't think that we should go forward saying that city residents should be responsible for reimbursements on this particular project, when in fact there's nothing in here that says that it's going to be a benefit to area residents, such as in the case if it had surplus capacity.
Well, I just clarify on city residents, I mean, because the fees are paid by people that develop projects within the city, so if it's external to the project, the fees are going to come from developers in other areas of the city that pay fees.
Those are still in other developers, and then the property owner bought the house, and in effect they paid for it. So I mean, it still works. I guess my point is, this development should pay for itself and shouldn't rely on outside resources from the city to pay for it. So as long, and I'm not adverse if it's demonstrated that there is surplus capacity and there's benefit outside the boundaries of this, that we would then look at a reimbursement agreement. But the way, for purposes of this development agreement, I don't think it's right that the balance of the city should have to pay for any portion of it.
So one of the things that we talked about last time was the requirement for the 2 5-acre parks that you were going to build. They were going to build more than 2 5. They were going to build 4 parks, correct? So we have the requirement for the 2. Does that mean if the builder chooses to build 4, that he would receive credit for those parks, even though it might not be a requirement because they chose to build them? We now turn around and give them credit for it? Because it doesn't say that we ask them to construct a facility. It just says if they construct a facility which is included in the city fee program, like parkland, would be an example of something included in the, would they then be entitled to credits and reimbursement?
So I think the answer to the question is that the developer is not going to build infrastructure that we don't require the developer to build just because they want to expend the money to build infrastructure.
Sometimes it's for a marketing purpose, or, you know, I mean, it was for the, you know, for the project. I mean, because last time that was what the applicant said, was that he was building in excess of what we require.
So the starting point is that we would require the infrastructure. The second part is it needs to be within our fee program to, you know, to be subject to reimbursement. So I feel like those 2 items are safeguards. I don't know if that answers your question fully.
So Steve, what control would the city have over that, wouldn't the developer have to come, if they were gonna do something like build a well that would serve more than their own project, wouldn't they have to be working with the city from the very beginning and getting approval to do so, including concern about reimbursement? If we say no as a city that, sorry, we don't go along with you, then would they be unable to do it without the city's consent?
Well, there's going to, in addition to being part of our fee program, there's going to be improvement plans that are submitted for the project, which detail all public infrastructure that is going to be constructed and is approved by the city before that is built. And then, as indicated in section 4.4.1, credit and reimbursement is going to be subject to a subsequent agreement. And so the developer would have to negotiate with us a credit and reimbursement agreement in order to be eligible to receive credit or be reimbursed.
So the point I was trying to make is the city would have control over some project that was over capacitating, or however you want to demonstrate it. Not that they could simply go and do something, construct a structure and expect the city to reimburse them for it without the city being aware of it.
That's correct.
And approving it. Does that make sense? Okay.
We develop the master plan through consultants that work for the city. We then decide what goes in our fee program as part of the fee study, and whether that includes soft costs or does not. And then ultimately, they're only able to get credit under the reading of this as I see it. We have attorneys in the room that are smarter than I am, but to the extent that it's included in the program and was not required to serve the subdivision, i.e. excess capacity or excess fair share that would go beyond the scope of the project, then and only then will they become eligible to the extent that they have built it or paid for it, and then only if and when we collect the fees, and then only if we have an agreement to do so.
And that seems to be obvious, but I think maybe we needed to be sure that everyone understood that.
Well, and if there's just, what kind of verbiage did you want to change it to? And if it's agreeable,
It was just the last word of the last sentence of that paragraph. Instead of saying within the city, it would be within the project area. That leaves open the opportunity to negotiate an agreement if something is found during the development of the improvement plans that there is something that actually deals with excess or surplus capacity. But I don't think it should be a citywide reimbursement program.
Again, if I may. As staff has pointed out, the city's adopted a master plan. It's your master plan. You've said this is the backbone infrastructure we want in the city. The city's also adopted a fee which is designed to finance the construction of your backbone. And that fee program is typically designed such that either the city builds it and gets reimbursement from everybody in the city, or you ask the developer to do it. And so the developer is entitled to reimbursement for building master plan infrastructure, just like the city is. So for me, it's a much simpler question. We will only build what you tell us to build. We will only build what you put into your master plan. And as the builder of that improvement, we're entitled to a reimbursement just like the city would be. And the city's designed the fee program to collect the fees from everybody in the city. So we're not changing your master plan. We're implementing your master plan. So the notion that a developer may get credits or reimbursement from outside the four corners of their boundary is completely consistent with your fee program. So with all due respect, I think the language works. I think it's consistent with your master plan.
Well, I guess my concern is that, it says in the event that the landowner constructs a facility which is included in a city fee program. I guess my question is that it's a required facility. If we're requiring him
if we're requiring the landowner to construct a facility, then that's in our feed program, I absolutely believe, yes, they are entitled to reimbursement. I just want to ensure that somewhere down the road, they're not constructing some facility that's not required by us, such as parkland or things that are in our master plan that are required, and for whatever reason, I mean, like I said, if they choose to construct something that's outside of what we require.
I think we can make that, so in that first sentence, Bill, what if we said in the event that the landowner constructs a facility which is included in the city's feed program and which is required by the city?
That'd be fun.
Not, not to belabor the issue, but not all, at least what I recall, all improvements within the master plans, and you take water. You have major water lines. Well, there may be a major water line down Walnut Avenue, but it serves principally just that area. So not all improvements in the master plan are those that are necessarily reimbursable, depending upon the size and the scope and the geographic area of the area it's serving.
I think the answer to that question is your fee program. Your fee program is based upon all those improvements. A loop water system with major improvements provides benefits to everybody that takes water through the system. That's an engineer. I'm not the engineer in the room. I will defer to the engineer on that. But again, it's your master plan and it's your fee program. You said you want a line of a certain size in Walnut, and it provides a loop system, increased pressure flow for the benefit of the city. That's why it's in your master plan. So we're just going to implement your master plan, and I think we're entitled to reimbursement for building what is essentially a city pre-approved facility.
If it's in excess of what's reasonably used within the project. I mean,
Exactly.
That's the caveat,
That's
right?
the
It's
key.
not the fact, it's, yes, you're implementing our master plan, and I understand if it's in excess of what's going to be used by the project, then you're entitled to credit. But if the city deems that, that water main or whatever, that water line really is primarily for that project, is going to be used by that project and is not in excess of what's going to be used within the project, then it wouldn't be eligible for reimbursement, correct? I mean, this is really up to the city to decide things like our water main, is a main water pipe going down Walnut for all of that area, or is it primarily for that project?
And I don't know the answer to the intricacies of your fee program, but I'll tell you what most jurisdictions do. Their fee program would assume that that is a shared cost by everybody in the city. And so we're not asking for anything more than what's in your fee program. As staff has pointed out, we can't recover anything that's not in your fee program. But that, in most jurisdictions, the fee program would have assumed that the city was building 100% of the facilities, and the city's going to charge back to everybody that connects 100% of the cost. So, again, we're not asking for anything that's not already in your fee program. We couldn't get anything that's not built into your fee program.
I understand that, but it's surplus capacity versus what is required to serve the subdivision. And this paragraph that I'm reading, we've only talked about the project. And so if we're only talking about the project and improvements to serve the project, how can there be necessarily surplus or excess capacities other than, say, the water well, the theoretical water well that we're not building? So that's really not even on the table. So how can there be a reimbursement? That's my point.
Can I jump in just for a second? I think, Kurt, is in your mind, you're making a distinction that we need to clarify, and I may be off base, but I'm just going to throw that out there and try to facilitate this. The development agreement is not saying that the project is only required to serve, that the public improvement, the subject public improvement is only required to serve their project. It's just saying that it's a requirement to build a project. That public improvement may also serve areas outside the boundaries of the project.
Agree. And that's surplus or excess capacity. What I'm saying here is, unless it is specifically identified as excess capacity, then it is paid for within the boundaries of this project. That's all I'm saying.
And that's where I think the discussion about the fee program kicks in, because the fee program will resolve that issue. Because the fee program is
But if there's no excess capacity within,
right?
then what credits do you have?
You wouldn't have it.
That's my
And
point.
But that's why I'm saying you defer to the fee program, because the fee program will identify from a monetary perspective whether or not there is excess capacity that's being built. Because the fee program is going to calculate all the public improvement costs, divide that by everybody that benefits from it, and come up with a fee. And to the extent that what they're building does not exceed the amount of fees they would have to pay, then there is no reimbursement. But if it does, then that means they're entitled to reimbursement, because there clearly would have been some infrastructure.
That raises a whole other issue, a level of issues, whether it was constructed most efficiently or best practices. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but just because there's an inflated cost, there should be a provision in here that whatever our fee is, and I think we talked about that earlier, that's the maximum that they would be reimbursed.
That's right. That's what I just said.
So if there's no excess capacity within the project area, and we don't have to reimburse above the fee, then I understand what you're saying. But what I'm saying is, it would only apply if there is excess capacity. And this doesn't address the issue of just excess capacity, it just simply says the city. I think they're only entitled to reimbursement if there is excess capacity. And that should be a separate issue.
So with council's permission, is it okay if I proceed? I've got about 7 more slides to cover the development agreement, and then we can, I think we're at about 5:15, so then we can come back and spend whatever time we need on the issues. The next section that I wanted to talk about is...
Are we going over 4.3? 4.4.3? I did have a question on that. As part of the general plan, the area, and historically what the city had done in the past is, when you had open space, which was basically there to accommodate floodplains, and I think even in this development you have there's storm detention, retention, like there was in Dead Man's Gulch. At that time, and I don't know where the policies are. I didn't identify them in the general plan or anywhere else, where it talks about credit for open space here. Last time, those were areas that I think there was an outright dedication simply because they were undevelopable in accordance with the general plan. So I'm trying to figure out where we are with what I believe the existing policies are, because it talks about credits for open space.
So I think there's, as far as where the numbers came up, how the numbers were arrived as far as open space and trail, I'd have to defer to Tony on that. But what this section provides is that it provides a statement that the project includes excess open space and trails, and it doesn't talk about any current fee program. It just says that in the event that the city in the future were to adopt an open space and trail fee, which we don't currently have, and that fee was for the Eastview specific plan area, then the developer would be entitled to a credit for that for this excess open space and trails out of that new fee program. So it doesn't obligate us to do anything other than if in the future the city council decides in its discretion to create this new fee program within Eastview, then there would be an and the program was for open space and trail fees, then there would be an eligibility for credit.
Well, then to staff, Tony, on the 10 acres of open space, does that include the detention/retention basins that are in Gulch area there?
No, that was actually excluded from
All of the acreage was excluded
that portion of it was correct, yes.
from the open space calculation?
Correct,
Okay,
as far as credits are concerned.
okay. Thank you.
Okay, infrastructure capacity. So, what this section basically provides is that the city either has existing capacity or it has plans and funding in order to build capacity to serve the project, or the project is otherwise conditioned to provide the infrastructure necessary to serve the project. Then the section, this is 4441, goes on to say that as long as the landowner constructs the infrastructure, which the city requires it to do pursuant to the conditions of approval, and/or pays the fees, then the city agrees to make reasonable good faith efforts to provide water, storm drain, and wastewater infrastructure to the project. The next section on 44442 wastewater, this particular section provides that the city currently has capacity in its wastewater treatment plant to serve the project, and it will proceed with an expansion when we get to 85% of the existing capacity. As Mr. Winkler outlined at the last meeting, we have an existing permit for the plant, which frankly requires, when we get to the 85 percentile as far as the capacity on the existing size of the plant, we have an obligation under that permit to move forward with the expansion process, to initiate that effort. So what is in that this element of 44442 is not an obligation beyond that the city already has pursuant to its wastewater permit.
How many phases are there to the project? 5 or?
5 phases to the project.
I saw that that's the big lot subdivision, I take it?
That's correct.
And what is, there was a phase 5A and a 5B. What's the difference? I know one's in the eastern portion, one's in the western, so wouldn't that actually be?
Contiguous, so one was on the east and one was on the the 5A and the 5B weren't contiguous.
So they're separate parcels.
They're separate.
So 6 phases, I guess, then.
No, they would be built phase 5, but one's on the east and one's on the west of where phase 4 is. So phase 4 would start kind of in the middle where Liberty Ranch Road is, and then it would grow to the west and to the east.
So has anybody calculated how many units this would be for reservation of wastewater connection permits?
So there's not a reservation for the totality of the project within this development agreement or this particular section. The only time there's a reservation of capacity is first if there's the payment of the fees. And at the time that there's a payment of fees, then the developer would receive a will serve letter. And then there's the additional scenario where if there is a final map that has been recorded for a particular part of the project, so the lots have been created, and 30% of the lots within that particular village have been built out, that the city will reserve the balance of the lots, reserve capacity for the balance of the lots within that particular village up to a maximum number of units of 50. So basically, the thought behind this particular requirement was, first of all, it's to help the developer in marketing the project. But if you have a merchant builder that buys a 50-lot subdivision, they don't have capacity guaranteed at the time that they buy the project. They don't have capacity guaranteed with the first or the second lot. But once they build up the momentum such that they've actually constructed 30% of the homes within that subdivision, that the city would agree to reserve capacity for the balance of that village to the maximum of the 50 lots.
And how much, and we're contemplating something in the neighborhood of 23 villages, something like that, is that correct?
Do you have any idea on that? Tell me the significance of explain to me, I guess. It says the city will issue a will-serve letter and reserve capacity upon developers' payment of the wastewater connection fees for the units phase of the project. So then it goes on to explain how that process works. Is that how that reads? It says we'll issue a will-serve letter and reserve capacity upon the developer's payment of the wastewater connection fees for a unit or a phase of the project. So that, contemplates a situation where basically, when the fee gets paid, which is our normal practice, we reserve capacity. So if that's paid for a unit, we'll reserve capacity. If for whatever reason the developer wants to come in and pay the fee for the totality of the village, pay for the entire 100 lots or whatever, then we would reserve capacity at the time that we receive the payment. So that's what that statement contemplates.
So in effect, they would reserve full capacity for each phase of the project without filing the final map, or they could do that, is what you're saying.
They would have to record the final map first and create the lot, and then if they came in and they paid the fee on all of the lots within the village, then we would reserve capacity for all of the lots that they paid for.
Or if they paid the fees on 30%, we would reserve the capacity on that 30% and up to another 50 units that they haven't paid fees on, correct? I mean, that's what I'm reading.
Yes.
They could come in, pay fees on, if there's 100 lots, pay fees on 30 of them, and now they have reserved capacity for 8.
Or they would have
50
capacity.
additional lots.
They would have capacity for up to the 50 maximum for a period of 2 years. Yes.
50 plus the 30% they paid on, correct?
Correct.
I'm back under the will serve. So we would issue a will serve letter if they came in and paid the fees for all units within any particular phase. Is that what it's saying? For all units?
If they come in and they pay the fee, then they have bought capacity. I think that's our current practice, right?
Yeah, right now, it's first come, first served based on the payment of our connection fees.
Correct.
And so that's not a deviation. What is a deviation is this 50 lots for 2 years after payment of a third of a given phase, that we're saying that we'll assure you that you can finish 50 more homes within that phase, provided it's done within 2 years. That's the only deviation from current practice. The other thing I'd like to clarify while you're thinking about that, and I apologize for catching Steve unawares here, is we've been re-reviewing our current new permit that we just received, which is 1,200 pages, and they've actually changed the 85% rule that you see stated at the beginning of 4.4.4.2, and so I'd be proposing that we revise wording slightly to be consistent with our current permit. We don't want to put ourselves in a position of having to do more than what we are required to do under our state permit. And I don't expect or anticipate that the developer would have a concern, but what our current permit requires is that, and I said this at the last meeting, is that when we, on an annual basis, we have to project growth rates looking at a 4-year horizon. And when we reach the point where we believe that based on our current 4-year projection, we will reach plant capacity, at that time we must submit a plan for expanding capacity of the plant. And then completion would have to occur by the time we reach capacity. So rather than 85%, I would recommend that we revise the wording to be consistent with the current state requirement. that says, and I'm reading, I'll interject if you'll entertain this for the record. The first sentence would read, "The city currently has capacity in its wastewater treatment plant to serve the project and other reasonably foreseeable growth." No change there. Second sentence would read, "The city agrees it will endeavor to proceed with," here I would insert, "plans for expansion of the wastewater treatment plant to its permitted capacity when projected demand, rather than existing demand, is anticipated to reach existing plant capacity within 4 years." That would be the change I would make to sentence 2. And that would be consistent with our current permit requirements and would make it clear that we're not required to expand the plant at 85%. When we reach a 4-year projection based on updated growth projections based on the economy at the time, and we think we'll reach capacity within 4 years, at that time we would submit a plan to the state for expansion and would be required to complete expansion before we exceed plant capacity, again with a 4-year outlook.
Okay,
Mayor, just on behalf of the applicant, we're agreeable with that. We actually wanted the city to start at 75%, but we lost that argument. So dovetail it with your current regulatory requirements.
thank you. Next section under infrastructure capacity deals with potable water. And as we've talked about before, the developer is not required to install the well, but will pay the city's water connection fees. Okay, parkland dedication and maintenance. The parkland dedication requirements are in attachment J to the development agreement, and I just got this afternoon. I passed out a copy of J to the council, and like I said, I haven't even had a chance to spend much time with it, but I did deliver it to you this evening.
Jay?
We can talk more about it at the next meeting on this particular project. The dedication of the parkland would occur with the recording of each portion of the small lot map. There's a particular section relating to parcels 8 and 32 in the project. And basically what the development agreement provides for parcels 8 and 32 is that those two parks, the developer would retain those as private property, would continue to pay taxes on those properties, maintain it as private property during the marketing phase of the project. There would be public use of the property allowed, subject to some reasonable restrictions. And then when the developer reached the point where he was done with the marketing of the project, then those two parcels would, dedication would be accepted and they would become public property.
I have a question on this. And to what extent has Parks and Recreation been involved in determining what type of active recreation would go into these reserve parks, if any? Because we are going to have, if my understanding is correct, that these are going to be pretty much passive parks for purposes of marketing the product, so that I don't know that they are envisioning ball fields or anything like that. If not, there is some concern on my part that the applicant is requesting reimbursement or credits against the dedication and the improvements. Well, the improvement side is what I have a concern with, in that I don't know that full reimbursement would be appropriate if, in fact, the city has to go back and do remedial work in order to make them accommodate what the city's needs are at the time. So I think that there should be a provision in here such that any costs that we incur in remediating the site or undoing what was done before, there should not be a credit given to the developer. I mean, it's pretty much silent on that. It just simply says if he does improvements and he dedicates, we're going to give credits or reimbursements. You know, and I think, you know, we've talked about this before. I don't know that it's appropriate for the landowner, and I understand what he's trying to do, but if it is a park and it's not a public park because the developer wishes to retain it for marketing purposes, but it is a park of sorts. It concerns me that he controls the activities on the park property, when in fact the underlying intent and purpose is as a public park. And I think, you know, I don't know where council stands on that, but to me that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
I would ask, do these parks comply with the park master plan?
So we've got two different types of parks here that are being proposed. We've got the 5-acre park, which is considered a neighborhood park. That's the one that's just immediately adjacent to the school. And per the specific plan, that's been designed for active with ball fields and whatnot. The two smaller parks are just considered
Tot lots.
basically something similar to tot lots. And a parks master plan does not require active play fields and whatnot within those types of parks. And so what the specific plan shows is a variety of, again, somewhat passive uses. You've got picnic areas, you've got trails. I think what I understand the applicant was asking is that if somebody, for instance, wanted to come and set up a, you know, bring in a goalpost or whatnot, that they prefer that didn't happen. But the Parks Master Plan does not require those in the first place. So, an answer to your question.
Well, but it is not defined as a passive park, given 5 acres in size. That's an active park.
Well, no, and the two parks, and maybe Sam, correct me if I'm wrong, the two parks that we're talking about are the two smaller ones.
The two private ones in the...
No, well, we've got a total of 5 areas, basically. So you've got the two private ones, which are 1.5 acres, and those are against the Gulch. And those will be the HOA maintained parcels. And you've got the two smaller parks, which are parcels 8 and 32. And those are the two that we're talking about that are not required to have that.
Do you have any slides of this for benefit of the...
We do, somewhere in there. But then we've got the neighborhood park, which is the one adjacent to the school, and that's the 5-acre one. And correct me if I'm wrong, Sam, but that is not going to be used for your marketing purposes.
So when this says that the landowner shall be entitled to credits against the city's park-like dedication and improvement ordinance at the time of the offer of dedication, it would think to me that they wouldn't be entitled to the credits until we accept the offer. I mean, till
I agree.
acceptance of the dedication. Just because they offer it to us, if we don't accept it, I don't think they're entitled to the credits until we accept the dedication. The other thing it says is that, you know, upon written 90-day notice to the city, we shall accept the offer of dedication. But if for some foreseeable down the future, we're talking 10 years or more, you know,
We could change it to May.
I just, yeah, I think that, you know, the landowner, on 90 days written notice to the city, I think the city may accept the offer of dedication and shall thereafter maintain the park. And I also think that at the time of the landowner's not entitled to the credits until we do accept the dedication of the park. Because for some reason we choose not to. I'm not going to tie the hands of council or the city in the future that there might be some unforeseeable reason that they choose not to accept the dedication of the park. Maybe because they doesn't have the improvements or it doesn't fit.
I also think that there should be an outside date by which the property is dedicated to the city. I don't think it should be unlimited.
Where's that at? What do you need to put
Right.
it in?
I think, taking note of all those points, and we'll talk to the developer before we bring this back on the fifth.
Just an answer to your request there. So we've got the 5 different areas. We've got the 2 smaller areas again within the
Those are the two private parks, right?
Those are the 2 private parks. The 2 areas that we're talking about here that would be maintained for a period and then dedicated would be this parcel here or this park, and then this one down here. This is the 5-acre park against the school, which would have the active ball fields that would be not subject to
Well, what I'm saying is, and maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I recall, when I looked at the park master plan, I think parcels anywhere from 5 to 8 acres were considered active.
Correct.
Park.
And so that's why I'm saying this particular one here would fall within that category.
Well, what's the acreage on the one to
This
the...
is 4.2 and this is 2.7.
Now, you know, for the amount of I guess, student generation in there, to me, I think we're lacking in the area of active parks. I really do.
Well, keep in mind too that the Parks Master Plan actually only called for 2 parks. It called for this particular park
No, that was the general plan, I believe.
and the Parks Master Plan. They're identical. And then this particular one in the non-participating area. This has been designated on the land use plan to be maintained and then developed in the future once this area develops out. So technically, the project does meet the Parks Master Plan requirements.
Yes, and I'd have to, you know, I'm not going to dispute that at this point, but that calculation includes credit for private parklands, correct?
What they would be basically paying for, or what they get credited for, is what we would allow them to. They are required actually by the code to dedicate or provide over 20 acres worth of parks out there. So what they would get credit for, so to speak, would be for these 4 well, basically the 3 parks here that we're talking about. Again, this park, and this park.
4, 5, and what'd you say, 3 acres?
Yeah, 2.5, 2.7 here.
Where's the balance if they owe?
Well, so the balance, they're not actually getting any credits for this. The balance would be fees that they need to pay. There would be the Quimby fees that they will be required to pay. And that is a condition of approval for the map.
So they're not getting any credit for the private parks?
The 2 HOA maintained ones, they would get, and our code allows this, as I mentioned at the last meeting, they would get 50% credit because, again, the assumption is that with, for instance, if they develop a pool or a community room or whatnot, their neighbor or their residents would be using that and taking some of the use of other facilities citywide and off, and so that they would get, again, some credit. At least they'd be eligible for that.
Wouldn't it make more sense that we knew that they were going to have those facilities provided rather than guessing? I would suggest that we give no credit unless it is determined that they have provided those types of activities that would therefore relieve the burden on the existing community. I mean, and that was your point at the last meeting, I believe.
Correct, and again, that is the assumption behind the ordinance. So, and we could potentially build that again into this document. And
Well, I'm asking council because it's really a council decision. That's a policy issue on whether you want to do that or not.
Council, actually, I think that the answer to Councilman Campion's concern is addressed when the subdivision maps come in, because that's when you make your determination of Quimby Act credits. That's when you make the determination as to whether or not private facilities can be credited. So there is an orderly process already in your ordinance, your development code, that essentially the developer has to establish at the subdivision map stage whether or not there will be private facilities. If there aren't that are creditable, then they got to pay the full fees under your ordinance.
I appreciate your comment. I wasn't expecting it tonight, but it was in order to give direction to staff in order to prepare or make adjustments to whatever documents are coming forward.
Okay.
Okay, the next section I want to talk about briefly is wetlands, section 447. And the developer would retain and maintain all of the wetlands property that is covered by an Army Corps 404 permit until such time as the permit conditions have been fully satisfied. And then the city would accept the dedication of those wetlands properties subject to the developer providing a maintenance funding mechanism for those properties.
I have a question. It says a funding facility financing plan or funding of an endowment by the landowner. I have can you explain to me exactly what that is and how it will work?
So I think a funding of an endowment would basically be that the developer would put on deposit an amount of money that would generate sufficient revenue on an annual basis to provide for the maintenance of that property.
In perpetuity.
Right.
I'm not comfortable with that. I don't know about council. I would rather have some form of assessment financing put in place to guarantee that we do have the funding available for that. Because otherwise it's going to fall to, depending if it's the homeowner association driven or left to the city to subsequently finance. So I would strike out anything dealing with an endowment by the landowner.
How are our current wetlands maintained? Through what sort of funding is?
So the city, when Northeast Pacific Plan was done, which uses Dead Man's Gulch as the primary repository for its storm drainage, a 404 permit was obtained, and my understanding is that the city took the lead on a project to widen and create capacity, but that the intent of the design and the sizing was such that it would be allowed to return after those improvements were done to a riparian sort of natural habitat. Hence a lot of the willows and duckweed and cattails and other growth that you see. The developer, in coming in upstream of much of that, has had to look at the downstream capacity and confirm that the various roughness coefficients, to use an engineering term, that they will not trigger or cause a downstream impact with their flows, and in fact will be retaining and allowing to meter in off-peak supplemental flows beyond that which are currently in place from the upstream properties. I'm going to stop there, make sure I don't feed you with a fire hose if you just wanted to sit.
I just want to know how it's funded. Wasn't that what that
How is
question?
it funded? We have
That was the question.
a Tier 1 and Tier 2 storm drain fee. Tier 2, I believe, was put in place around the time and maybe in contemplation of the Northeast Specific Plan, and all new development is currently required to go into Tier 2 or other equivalent funding mechanism is our typical condition. That is frozen in time with the exception of a modest CPI adjustment, which I think is 2% per year minimum, otherwise to equal the CPI. And that is currently between the Tier 1 areas, which are Old Town flat rate fees on properties, and the new Tier 2 for new development are generally, we were in a budget meeting today, the stormwater fund is overtaxed, much like our road fund is overtaxed. That's an existing condition that is not generally the new development's responsibility. So what we've built into this is that they have to have a mechanism, and part of the financing plan looks at any deficiencies in current funding levels and looks at what should be required. So we've got an existing deficiency, but we would look at this development would have to pay its full freight towards necessary maintenance.
So the existing community has a deficiency that the existing community needs to pay for. But this new development, the fees would be structured such as to help, that would cover the cost of this wetlands maintenance?
Of the wetlands that are approved for this project. Everything downstream.
Downstream is already the responsibility of the existing homeowners.
Is there a reason it wouldn't go in a lighting landscape district?
That is one of several mechanisms that would be used. I think the reason that we've got sort of this broad general language is if they're already doing a CFD actually has broader authority to do things than a lighting landscape district does. And rather than have many additional layers, you could do a CFD that would do all of the above, so to speak.
My preference would be a permanent financing program rather than an endowment. I don't know what the rest of the council thinks.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, our financing plan that has been submitted as part of this project, approved by your consultants, includes full funding for maintenance of this facility as an ongoing obligation. So this language that's in here, it dovetails with the financial work that's already been submitted to the city.
And I believe that the wording, and I'm paraphrasing, so I don't have it in front of me, but is of a form acceptable to the city, and if an endowment is not acceptable, then we don't approve that. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll talk to the developer before the next meeting on that phrase as well. Moving along to section 5, this is applicable rules, regulations, fees, and official policies. And basically, this is the second half of the vested protection that the developer gains through this development agreement. The project would be subject to those rules in effect as of the effective date of the development agreement. As I indicated earlier, the project would be subject to new rules required by state or federal law. And there are certain categories in the Section 5 which the city has carved out as a reservation of authority, and those basically include existing and new processing fees, existing or new construction standards and building codes, and new increases in existing utility charges. And Bertie had talked to me earlier today about the wording retail in 5.4.3, and I will talk to the developer about removing that before we bring this document back as well.
You know, I can't let it go past here. Under city rules generally, there are no city rules anymore. The city's documents, plans, policies, ordinances are all being replaced by a couple of, by this batch of documents. And I guess my concern is, you know, we've had a general plan that's been in place since 2009. We revised the development plan a little over a year ago. We have master plans in place, and every other development has basically complied with those types of regulations that guide future development in the city of Galt. I cannot find any overwhelming reason to completely, and in some cases throw out what the existing regulations are, particularly when it comes to land use, subdivision design, lot sizes, setbacks, I think all that are critical to a lot of people in this community. I would not have a concern if we were using our zoning classifications, whether it's R1C or R2, or R3. I mean, those are, you know, standard. It has been accepted in the community, and I think that I don't see the significant public benefit to deviate from what has worked in this city for 30, 40 years, and that's my concern. And that's, you know, council, you know, is gonna vote the way they want, but I feel that I have to at least voice my opinion as to, you know, why I think we should not make these changes, and I just don't see any of the overwhelming benefit. I think that what we have is a very high-density development, which is not what was contemplated in the general plan, and have real concerns with it, and I think in the future, other people will as well. Lastly, I understand the exceptions as it relates to the vested rights, but I still think that the landowner should be subject to whatever the regulations are at the time of development. This city council just approved the project less than 2 months ago. It was a vested right project. The applicant not only agreed, we asked and he not only agreed, we made the change where it would be the regulations in effect at the time that the development occurs.
Regulation and fees.
Regulations and fees. So I think, you know, this isn't something that's new. We've done it in the past, and I see no reason to deviate from it. That's all I have for now.
Okay, so speaking of fees, which is section 6, actually this project has agreed to pay all current fees. That includes processing and inspection and plan check fees, whatever the current rate is at the time that the service is required. and the developer would also be subject to all impact and connection fees, as long as those fees are adopted on either a citywide basis, applied to all properties on a that are uniformly situated, so basically similar types of projects, they would pay the fee. The only time they wouldn't pay the fee is if you adopted a particular fee that was only focused on Liberty Ranch or Eastview, then they would not have that obligation. But basically, the bottom line is if you're going to adopt a fee or increase a fee, and everybody's going to be subject to it, then they're happy with everybody being treated in the same manner.
So if we increase our connection fees, our water connection fees, and we increase them citywide, then they're acceptable to paying those increasing fees, as long as we implement on all new development.
Yeah, that's correct.
I do have a question, and this is under 6.2, under exactions and development impact fees. Under your, there's there are 3 items that are noted, Karen, numbers. Number 2 says apply uniformly to all properties within the city that are zoned consistent with the project approvals. I don't know of any, who is going to make the determination of what is zone consistent? Because the zoning is not the same and there is no consistency here.
Well, if we were operating under that particular situation, that would be a city determination, and and we would impose the fee. Obviously, if the developer felt that the fees were not being applied on a uniform basis to all properties that are zone consistent, then they would have to challenge our collection of the fee.
But what I'm asking the city is how is the city going to make that distinction? Because there is no property that is zoned the same. I mean, I'm not arguing that he may argue it, but how are you going to even come to any conclusion? And,
Well, I think it's hard to answer that in the abstract. I think the bottom line between items 1, 2, and 3, which is basically as long as the city is going to adopt a fee that is not just focused on this particular project, which means it's going to be on a citywide basis, it's going to be applied to all residential subdivisions, similar type projects, that we are going to be able to impose the fee. I don't know that I could answer it in any more detail at this point in time.
Okay.
Okay, section 6.3, community facilities district. So the first part of this is the infrastructure community facilities district. Section 6.3.1 provides the developer may initiate and the city shall form a community facilities district. It provides in this section that the maximum tax rate would not exceed 1.9%. That rate was agreed to with the contemplation that a certain portion of that CFD funding would be used for school facilities. We still are in negotiations between the city, the developer, and the school district, regarding a solution on the funding of school facilities. I think we've had a very positive meeting earlier this week, and I'm hoping that as we progress forward with this project, we'll have more concrete positive news to report to you. But that 1.9% rate did anticipate a certain element of funding for school facilities.
See, this last paragraph where it says the formation of the CFD or failure of the CFD to be formed, and the failure of the landowner to comply with any of its obligations shall not affect or hinder the issuance of building permits or certificates of occupancy for residential lots within the property. If we don't have the CFD, I mean, that's the funding mechanism that's going to be used. I have a real problem that if it's not formed, or failure to form, or the failure of the landowner to comply, that we have no right to stop the project. I mean,
So the situation is that the developer has an obligation to install certain infrastructure for this particular project. The cost for the infrastructure for this project is the total project is about $130 million. Currently, it's anticipated at about $40 million of that money will come from the CFD. And the balance of that money will come from either city fee programs or developer equity. And so basically, if there's not a CFD and the developer wants to move forward with the project and they come up with another mechanism to fund it, such as their own pocket, then the fact that there's not a CFD would not preclude them from moving forward. They still have the obligation to put the infrastructure in the ground to serve the subject.
so it puts no liability on us or no requirement on us.
That's correct.
Because it made it sound like expressly that we shall act independently in forming it.
So, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, whether the CFD is formed is in the control of the city council. And so this provision's in this agreement because if for whatever reason the city council in its discretion decides not to form the CFD, that doesn't mean that the developer can't move forward with development of the project. They obviously have to find a way to come up with an additional $40 million to fund the infrastructure, but they can still move forward to develop the project.
Is the CFD ever paid off?
The CFD for this project is anticipated to have a 30-year life. And then and that's for the infrastructure CFD. And then the second CFD that's contemplated is the city services CFD, which I introduced earlier tonight, which is basically, that will either be CFD 2005 or an alternate district if the city council so desires to form a separate services CFD for this project.
So all of these things combined, the 2005 and the community facilities district, all of these things combined will not exceed 1.9% of the value of the home at the time of sale, or at the parcel, or?
Maybe I could get.
I guess I'm getting confused.
Help on that from the financing gurus on how that comes together.
The 1.9% is an estimate that's made at the time the CFD is formed. So there'll be a market study determining, or at least estimating, what we think the various home prices are going to be, and the special tax rates will be set based on that market study.
The question I have, and I was talking with Steve earlier today, is it says 1.9% of each parcel's estimated value. So is it going to be 1.9% in the future, or is it going to be based on a dollar value? Because the dollar value, 1.9% of the parcel is a heck of a lot different than 1.9% of the post-constructed home.
It's 1.9% of the
improved value.
Of what would be an improved lot.
Okay. So it will escalate, the tax will increase as improvements occur on the property, is that what you're saying?
And maybe I shouldn't use the word lot, of an improved house.
Okay, well, but they're saying that the initial is going to be based on the parcel's value.
Right.
Okay, so then we're going to have a step up once the home is constructed and the property is sold.
No, the 1.9% is based on the estimated assumed value of the lot as improved with the house. So doesn't have a house now, but the value is calculated based on the assumption that the house is built.
How can that be? How can you sell bonds based on that type of value when you only have unimproved raw dirt? I don't see.
Well, you wouldn't. We would set the special tax rates to meet that 1.9% requirement, but you wouldn't be able to sell bonds until you've got enough special tax revenue being generated in order to facilitate that. So the bond issue wouldn't necessarily happen, and the credit markets, you know, are such that you generally aren't issuing bonds based on raw land these days anyway. You generally need to get a quarter or a third of the way through your development to actually have some marketable bonds.
It's changed a lot then. Steve and I were talking about this earlier today, and I wasn't sure. So we will be issuing permits. Will the district's formation occur prior to, in theory, prior to the, if we're going to do a CFD, the CFD will be formed, then permits can be issued. Is that correct?
As long as, we need to get the CFD formed before there are actual homeowners out there. So it's possible that some building permits could be issued, but
well, I guess I want to know what provisions do we have in here. If we are doing a CFD, and that's going to be the contemplated, you know, financing mechanism to where we're not issuing permits and then having those homes sold, therefore your assumptions with regard to revenue stream are going to drop off because those homes won't be in the CFD. I mean, what provisions are there?
Wouldn't the CFD be formed before the any homes are sold, but the bonds would not be issued until we had proceeded with a certain level of development?
right. So yeah, that's what I said, right? So
I didn't get that. I asked if, whether the CFD was going to be formed before building permits are issued. That was my question.
Yes, I elaborated by saying it's possible that it could be formed after building.
That's not the answer I wanted to hear.
But the point is that it's got to be formed before there are homeowners out there.
Correct.
The homeowners would be the voters, and
Exactly.
we want the landowners to be the voters.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So the CFD is formed, and the homeowners pay into the CFD, and then somewhere halfway, third way through the project, then the bonds would actually be sold to generate the revenue in the future.
To pay for the infrastructure. And in that case, if there's only a third of the project that's developed, that 1/3 would generate, round numbers, a third of the revenue that's needed, but the land, the vacant land, or the undeveloped land that is in the remainder of the CFD would also generate the rest of the special tax revenue that's required to pay the debt service on the bonds.
It may be helpful to understand there are two different CFDs being talked about here. The first one is optional. If the developer wants to cash flow $40 million, good luck to you. But if they elect to form an infrastructure CFD to reimburse themselves, then we would have to proceed with that as long as it met all the requirements. The second one, the second last sentence on page 9, is the services. That's how we pay for the ongoing maintenance. That must be formed before any building permits are issued.
Well, actually, it says if the city chooses to form the CFD. Because we're the ones that are going to act independently and form the CFD to pay for the financing of the infrastructure by the developer.
Yeah, the CFD.
It wasn't the developer forming the CFD, it was the city.
Only we can take that action.
Yeah.
The CFD for services needs to be done before any building permits are issued, and that's because you got to have that thing in place to help you pay for services. But the infrastructure CFD, as they're indicating, is really something that the developer would want to do, and it's a joint process. I mean, the city and the developer together would go through this CFD formation process, collaboratively. And Steve made a good point about the fact that the bonds would actually be used to reimburse the developer for infrastructure that it has already installed. So the timing of the CFD isn't creating a burden on the city at all. All it's doing is creating a mechanism to reimburse the developer for infrastructure that it has constructed.
Okay, I have two more slides. I know it's been a really exciting show this afternoon. Okay, now to section 7 on amendment or cancellation. A few points I just wanted to mention. In this area, the agreement can be modified because of a conflict with state or federal laws. If there was such a conflict, the parties would have to come together in good faith and attempt to come up with a change to the agreement to address the change in state or federal law. The agreement can be modified or terminated by mutual consent of the parties, which is not a surprise. Under Section 8, there's also a mechanism, which is required by state law, for the annual review of the development agreement to confirm that the developer is complying with the agreement in good faith. And the way that that periodic annual review occurs is it starts at staff level, and to the extent that staff does not identify any particular issues with the project, then it stays at an administrative level. But to the extent that there are problems identified, then it would be elevated to the Planning Commission and if need be to the City Council. In the event that we went through that process and found that the developer was not in compliance with the development agreement, there's an ability to terminate the agreement under Section 8.5. Some miscellaneous provisions in the back end of the document I want to call to your attention. First, there's no right by either the city or the developer to seek monetary damages. So in the event that there is a breach of the agreement by either side, let's presume the developer believes the city is in breach of this agreement. The developer does not have the ability to sue the city for damages. What they would be seeking is to have a court order to compel the city to comply with the terms of the agreement. There's also a section that the city would be reimbursed for any third-party legal actions against the project or the agreement. We mentioned earlier the agreement does run with the land, which means it binds subsequent owners of the property. And typical with most other city agreements, there is a provision indemnifying the city and insurance protection during the construction of any public infrastructure. So that is the summary of the document. Be happy to answer any questions.
Council, questions? I do have speaker sheets on this. Jim Clausen.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council. In reading this document, I have questions over several different items. One thing I'd like to bring up first is regarding parks. They mentioned you're going to have the 1 5-acre park adjacent to the school that will be fenced off and have chains on it during the day. It's open on weekends. That's part of the school. So it is not a public park. So the only time we get to use it is on weekends and when school is not in session. So the term public park doesn't quite ring true. And next, I have a question is regarding to the will serve letters, guaranteeing them a certain amount of sewer and water. I was with the city for 17 years. 1 year alone, we issued over 600 building permits. We never had any will serve. It was always the developers in our community, the developers who were here. Whenever they were ready to build, they came in, they pulled permits. What this is doing is this is jumping in, this developer ahead of the developers already in our community and perhaps already in our area for our build out. So I don't see why we should give them a foot up. I think they should have to wait their turn, just like everyone else, as far as they shouldn't be guaranteed anything that our other builders are not guaranteed. Now, I'd like to address item 4.4.43. Hope I got all the fours right. It says the city shall install potable water improvements to permit delivery of potable water to the project. City shall provide. Why are we paying for it? The developer's coming to our community. If he wants a water line ran to them so they can then have potable water, why aren't they paying for the cost of putting the line in? If they didn't come, we wouldn't have to spend the money. Plain and simple. And I also would like to address the issue of, I'm sorry, I've lost my point here. I live across from Dead Man's Gulch. The existing one that's on Walnut, adjacent to Marengo. Heard a lot of talk about them wanting to come in there and tear that up. I mean, clean it up, make things so better. Well, I just want to make sure that we keep a close eye on what they do. Because when I bought my home, I had to pay a premium just so I could look at that instead of neighbors. And I like the birds a lot better. And lastly, I think that citizens of Galt will be real surprised to find out that we're going to reimburse the developer for any cost citywide. If the developer is going into a business, they should know what the costs are and be able to support those costs without the city of Galt in its entirety paying to help them. So I ask you very carefully, one last thing. When I read this document, it sure seems like it is slanted towards the developer and doesn't have the protection of the city involved. I ask you to read it carefully and make all the changes that Mr. Campion was talking about, because those were common sense items. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Sherry Daly? Sorry? Thank you.
I did have a question. I'd like to follow up on that, Mr. Clausen's question on 4.4.4.3. What improvements are contemplated under that, Mr. Winkler?
Well, I think if you read in the totality of the context here, what's intended is that if it's a requirement of our master plan and is necessary to serve, and we're taking connection fees, that those off-site improvements would be put in at the expense of the city, including any on-site improvements that are identified in our water impact fee. Clearly stated in 4.4.1, first sentence, the landowner must construct all improvements required to serve the project. And you got to weigh those things. And we're saying that rather than put a well in, that they would pay their connection fees and the city would determine when and where to put in the next well as part of our master plan.
So these would be improvements that would be subject to reimbursement only through the master plan, is that what you're saying?
Through the connection fee programs, which will be updated prior to them pulling any permits.
And the fee studies will be complete by then?
So that's our goal. We expect to have them done within the year and brought back to council, and we don't contemplate that they could get annexed, get plans approved, and get building permits pulled, and if they were, they'd be a handful.
Okay. Thank you.
I have no further public comment. Do I have anything further from the council? Mr. City Attorney, it looks like you want to have something to say.
Just when you get to the end of the meeting, I had a suggestion, sir.
Well, we're there.
Okay, so if we're done with this workshop, I'd recommend that you adjourn the meeting, and there's a separate special meeting agenda for this evening, and so I recommend after you adjourn this meeting to then call
call into order that separate special meeting.
So noted.
I have a question to council. Do we intend to discuss the specific plan itself? Because that has not been discussed, to my knowledge. It has not been discussed.
Was it not discussed by the planning commission?
No, I'm saying
It hasn't
this
been
by
discussed.
city council. I mean, there's been absolutely no discussion on that.
Are we gonna do any discussion?
I saw it.
I think we could, but I think that, it will be a lengthy meeting if we take it up on the 5th. I know that there's a public hearing that's been scheduled for that.
So the plan is April 5th, that this will all come back to us for a public hearing?
Correct, that would be
Possible action?
well, again, it would be up to you as far as, how far we get and whatnot, but yes, the first public hearing would be on April 5th.
All right.
Well, I do have a number of comments on the specific plan itself as well.
Okay. Ms. Daly, would you like your 5 minutes, please?
I apologize, there are 3 lights between my house and here, and they are all 3 yellow. Just quickly, I know you've all had a long evening, and I appreciate Mr. Cruz opening the hearing again. I just wanted to let you know in a little more detail why the Planning Commission made the recommendations that it did, and kind of give you our thoughts on it. So I made a little chart of what our last specific plan looked like, and what the percentages of lot sizes were according to our development code, and then compared those to what we're looking at in this project. And the main number in the middle, the R1C, and the R2, which is the medium density, which you all saw that the map changed to medium density today, is flip-flop. Our last specific plan, we had 51% of our homes in the R1C and 16% in the medium density, and now we're looking at 32 and 50. And most importantly, the top 2 rows show that we have no move-up housing. There might be some planned, there's none required. Doesn't match what we've done in the past. I don't see why we're not looking at a mix of housing sizes here. On the next page, I gave you what our development code describes medium density as. When we talked about it, it was supposed to be a feathering effect. So in other words, we'd have our low density residential, and then we'd have our high density, and there should be some feathering in the form of medium density in between. And what we've got with this project is all medium density. It's not a feathering effect, which is what we had planned that sort of density to be. And just a pictorial on the next 2 pages. The first picture is the Ashboro subdivision, and those are larger lots than what the 5,000 square foot feet are in the plan you're looking at. So, as you can see, there's barely any room in between the houses. There's no room for play areas, no room for a swimming pool, a garden. And then the next page is like the Rio Mesa over by what used to be the junior high school on the west side. And you can see the difference that the size and the lots really makes. And that's our development code there, as opposed to the first picture that shows something that's larger than what's being proposed in this plan. So I think it's important to visualize what we're looking at. And then I try to look at the numbers because, this is a negotiation. This developer brought forward not his minimum, not what he could get by with and barely make a profit. He brought you his maximum. So I tried to play with the figures a little bit. If we went to a more balanced approach, which is the balancing point page, and reshuffled the sizes of the lots, so we had a more mixture like we currently have, this is totally doable. With the same linear square foot at the front of these lots, we could distribute them more evenly in lot sizes. And the difference between a balanced approach and the table, and I'm not saying to use that balanced approach, do whatever numbers you want. I'm just saying this is a bargaining point. This isn't accept the project or not. It's what's best for the community and what will make the project work. With the balance that I showed, and that's just an example of one way we could go, that reduces the total dwelling units in that big mass of small lots by 58. That's less than 5% of this entire project, to make this a more balanced approach. So the Planning Commission passed this to you, but we did not pass the small lot map, and that's the reasoning. And there's room to negotiate this. There's room to make this project work for the developer and for the city. And it takes just some common sense to know that when you come to a bargaining table, the party that's bargaining on the other side is not starting where they intend to finish. They're starting at their maximum and asking us to accept it. And there's no reason to take a giant left turn for the city. The city's beautiful how it is. The residents are happy with the mixture of homes that we have. When you finish raising your small family, you can graduate to a larger home. If you have family in the Bay Area that has a big family or a big budget and wants to come to town, we have a mixture of homes. This plan does not. It has a lot of tiny houses on a lot of tiny lots. So the Plan Commission's recommendation was to work with the densities, work with the lots. I'll make a private pitch just for the pool because we're building that first pool. Thank you. It was very difficult. If we don't assess for that pool, we'll never get it.
Thank you. All right, with that, the special city council meeting is adjourned. Council stay standby. Hang on, gotta reopen the next one. Okay. And then I'm gonna call to order the special meeting of the Galt City Council